Les habla Pocho Salcedo y damos la bienvenida a nuestra audiencia en Sudamérica y a todos aquellos que nos acompañan de costa a costa en los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica, en Hawái y Puerto Rico. Una vez más, desde los estudios, esta vez de Cristo TV, en la ciudad de La Paz, Bolivia, acá en los Andes de Sudamérica, empezamos una caminata que va más allá de los titulares. Bienvenidos al ADN de las noticias. El siglo XXI ha visto el reconocimiento y despegue de las naciones indígenas originarias en el continente americano. Existe una agenda de inclusión y participación que han demandado los nativos americanos que han existido en estas tierras incluso antes de las colonias y desde luego antes que las repúblicas. Hoy hablaremos de la nación Cherokee en los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica, que por primera vez en la historia tendrán representatividad en el Congreso de los Estados Unidos. Con nosotros, desde el cuartel general de la nación Cherokee en Oklahoma, tenemos a Kim Teehee, una auténtica líder de la nación Cherokee, además es representante designada ante el Congreso de los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica. Kim Teehee, bienvenida al programa.
Thank you for having me.
Kim Teehee is Director of Government Relations for Cherokee Nation and Senior Vice President of Government Relations for Cherokee Nation Businesses. In 2019, Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. named Teehee as the tribe's first delegate to the U.S. House of Representatives. She previously served President Barack Obama as the first-ever Senior Policy Advisor for Native American Affairs in the White House, Domestic Policy Council for 3 years. Teehee also served as Senior Advisor to the U.S. House of Representatives Native American Caucus Co-Chair, Dale Kildee, Democrat Representative, for nearly 12 years. As Senior Advisor, she established an impressive record of accomplishments on a wide array of Native American issues. Teehee received her Bachelor in Arts in Political Science from NSU and her Juris Doctor from the University of Iowa College of Law.
Well, let's start right away, and we have a global audience, so let us give first some context as to why and how the Congress of the United States of America might be on the brink of installing a delegate from the Cherokee Nation in its midst. This is a momentous occasion with around 200 years in the making. Let me start by asking about the Trail of Tears, a period between the 1830s and 1850s. How that period impacted American nations, American Indians, and how did it impact you personally?
Sure. Well, that period of time that you just talked about was a time in our history when our relationship, the Cherokee Nation's relationship, was very rocky with the United States. There was great pressure put on the United States to use its treaty power to enter into these treaties with Indian tribes and remove them. And the question is why? Why? Well, discovery of gold, cotton. It was the policy at that time being espoused to remove the Indians from their current location. So the Indian Removal Act was passed by Congress for that purpose. Now, Cherokee Nation fought removal policies. We actually prevailed in the U.S. Supreme Court, but unfortunately, at the time, the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1830s was not that powerful. And the president at the time was Andrew Jackson, who was infamously known for helping to be the architect of Indian removal policies, was the president at that time. And even though the Cherokee Nation prevailed in U.S. Supreme Court decisions by fighting removal and fighting state authorities, Andrew Jackson infamously said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. At the time, John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. And so that paved the way for Cherokee Nation's treaty in 1835. An illegal faction of Cherokees entered into that treaty with the United States, where the Cherokee Nation agreed to give up 7 million acres of land in the east, but that illegal faction, they prevailed. The Senate ultimately did ratify that Senate. The President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, did sign that treaty in 1836, and it did become the supreme law of the land. Now, to enforce it upon the Cherokee Nation, that's what led to the infamous Trail of Tears, where a quarter of Cherokee Nation's population of mostly elders and children perished during that forced march. But the bad stuff didn't end there. It didn't end up into the 1850s. Throughout the 19th century, Congress kept enacting laws that worked to really dismantle the authority of the Cherokee Nation, to pass laws to be governed by them, even taking away the ability of ours to elect our own principal chief. It wasn't until 1970 that Congress once again enacted law and said to the Cherokee Nation, well, you can once again elect your chief. So we did that. And it wasn't until the mid-70s that Congress started actually finally giving the much needed resources to Cherokee Nation and tribes like ours who were in this situation of great poverty because of the policies of the past, started giving us resources to address infrastructure, housing, healthcare, education, those kinds of needs. And it's taken a lot of time to rebuild a nation where we feel today we can actually pursue a treaty right that's still the law of the land today, still valid. How this has impacted me personally is I have ancestors who were on that forced march, those who perished and those who survived. I come from tough stock. And so we often say that Cherokee Nation has been through a lot, but the one thing that we all have in common, those of us today whose ancestors survived the Trail of Tears, is perseverance. We persevere and we remember our history, and our job is to always fight and to make sure and advocate so that those kinds of policies never happen again. And one of the things that we want to do is to make sure that we bring justice to those who lost their lives on that forced march. And we think one of the ways to do that is for the House of Representatives to seat the delegate this year.
Thank you very much. And we go to nearly 190 years ago, the Echota Treaty, which was signed on December 29th of 1835. That treaty is old, but as you said, still alive and legally enforceable. Tell us its significance and why it could soon open the door to the Cherokee Nation to have a delegate to the United States Congress, a voice in one of the most powerful institutions in the world.
Well, that treaty is significant because the United States considers it the supreme law of the land. The U.S. Senate ratified it, and the President of the United States signed it in 1836. And so that's significant in and of itself. The United States, already took action to implement the provisions when they forced us to remove from the east to the west in modern-day Oklahoma. And so the significance of it is that, and the importance of this treaty right is it would give Cherokee Nation a seat at the table whenever formulating laws and policies that impact us. But our issues are similar to a lot of tribes in the United States. And so that's why we've been able to successfully receive the support of so many tribes and tribal organizations across the country. But in addition to that, it would send a strong message to the tribes of this country and even internationally that the United States is a country of its word, that it keeps its commitments that it made so long ago in the treaties that are still valid today. But it also, as I mentioned earlier, would give some small measure of justice to those people who lost their lives on that forced march.
Thank you very much, Kim. It took almost 2 centuries to come to this point. What changed for this to be within reach now? Can you describe this process? What was like for the Cherokee Nation building step after step to come to this moment in history?
Right. So, Cherokee Nation, it took many years to rebuild a nation. As I mentioned before, really it wasn't until the mid-70s that Congress started providing the necessary resources, the tools necessary for tribes to rebuild, having the funding in place so that we could develop infrastructure in our communities, in our often impoverished communities, where we could develop and build a healthcare system in place so that our citizens' healthcare needs could be addressed, so that we could actually start building housing, adequate housing for our citizens, as well as providing educational opportunities for our students. But also uniquely, so many of the policies within this country were designed to acculturate Indians into mainstream society. And so we lost a lot of our ability to have fluent Cherokee speakers. I'm blessed that my parents are still with me today. and both of them are Cherokee first language speakers, meaning they spoke Cherokee before they spoke English. And so one of the things that we're working on today is a massive undertaking to protect our language. We only have about 2,000 Cherokee language speakers today, of a citizenry that exceeds 441,000 tribal citizens. That makes us the largest tribal nation in this country, but only 2,000 can speak the language fluently. And these are mostly elders. And so we've taken on a very robust effort to make sure that we put dedicated resources behind this effort to revitalize our language, because if we don't do that, then it's going to die out. And so we've enlisted the assistance of our elders. We pay people to learn our language in a 2-year immersion program. We have a school that allows young kids to learn it too, and to communicate with elders who speak the language fluently as first language speakers, so they can better refine the language. So I also think uniquely honoring who we are culturally as a nation, but also part of that is helping preserve and protect our language as well.
Well, you are being designated as the delegate to the U.S. Congress. You have a substantial experience in Congress itself in the United States, in the executive branch as an advisor to former President Obama, and of course, extensive work within the Cherokee Nation. What would be your priorities in the first few years as a delegate to the U.S. Congress?
Well, I mentioned resources. There's still so much that needs to happen, and the needs of Indian country, the Cherokee Nation included, are great. The federal government cannot possibly fulfill all the needs that are necessary in order to achieve the relationship between the government and the United States, meaning the resources that are needed to do the things that we need to do to help our citizens live a quality of life. And so one of the things will be making sure that there's adequate funding, that there's forward funding, advanced appropriations, so that we have enough funding available for multiple fiscal years in order to do the things that we need to do in the healthcare space, public safety, education, housing, agriculture, and healthcare, absolutely, by far. Those would be some of the first things that we would do. And then I mentioned earlier, preserving who we are culturally. That means our sacred areas need to be protected, our language needs to be protected, and resources need to be put behind those efforts to protect and preserve those things that are precious and dear to us.
Well, the significance for other American Indian nations of having a Cherokee delegate in the U.S. Congress, it's also momentous because there's no history of that kind before. How have you been integrating with the other nations in the United States, and what are their thoughts about what's about to happen?
Well, we have, since the chief of the Cherokee Nation nominated me as delegate, and our tribal council, which is our legislative body, confirmed me in 2019 as Cherokee Nation's delegate. We have been traveling across the country, enlisting the assistance of so many tribal leaders and tribes across the country who believe that the United States is best when it keeps its word. Even though Cherokee Nation is the recipient of this particular treaty right, really the symbolism is that the United States honors the treaties and that keeps its word. That is something that every tribe in this country can sign on to, is that the nation is a nation of its word, and that the nation should act to implement its part of that treaty obligation. So that's something that we've been very busy doing. It's something that we've were able to achieve support for. We have the largest organization in the United States of tribes called the National Congress of American Indians. And they are the largest organization that tribes are members of. And so they passed a resolution supporting Cherokee Nation's delegate to Congress. And so we believe that we have the support necessary to get this moving along and to get the House to seat it. And so we're hoping that that happens this year.
Well, we have much more coming with Kim Teehee, and she will be right back with us after this short pause. Thank you. Good to have you back. You're about to be your nominated delegate to the U.S. Congress, and probably in a very near future you will be installed. What does a delegate to the U.S. Congress do? What are the powers? What are the responsibilities?
Well, in the United States, the Congress is comprised of multiple delegates that represent U.S. territories. And so we're asking to be treated similarly to U.S. territory delegates. They are distinguishable from representatives of the House. The sole legal distinction between delegates and House of Representatives is the vote for final passage. Delegates do not get to vote on final passage of proposals that go before the Congress as a body. What delegates get to do, however, is still plenty. So delegates get to serve in committees, they get to vote in committees, they get to introduce legislation, amend legislation, speak on the House floor. They just don't get to vote for final passage. So there's still plenty to do in order to address the needs of Cherokee Nation as a delegate.
So you get to participate in the inner workings of Congress, but also you act as almost like an ambassador to the Congress as well, representing the Cherokee Nation, isn't it?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Well, how was American history taught you during your school years concerning American Indians in the U.S.? What were those blind spots, if any, that you discovered on your own? Has the teaching of the Indian nation's history and heritage changed in the school systems in the U.S.?
Well, you hit on a topic that I talk about often in this journey to be seated in the House of Representatives. And it's this: we're not taught frequently enough in the public school system, which is where I learned, and went to school and graduated from in the United States, about federal Indian law and history. Very little is taught about this. Oftentimes it's up to the individual to take on their own elective courses or to seek the information out on their own. This has been prevalent throughout the discussion about Cherokee Nation's treaty right, because a part of this journey has been an educational journey where we have had to educate member of Congress after member, their staff, committee staff, about the United States relationship with tribes in this country, the federal Indian policies that were enacted in large part by Congress, and the policies that are difficult to talk about sometimes for people, which is like the Trail of Tears, an extermination of a people, right? The genocide of a people, things that happen as a direct result of federal enactment of law and policy. We're not always taught about these things. People generally know about Trail of Tears because they know that title, but what it means for a faction of Cherokee Nation to enter into a treaty with the United States that the United States then implements through forced removal of a people where a quarter of the population dies. I mean, that's dramatic. I'm not trying to be dramatic for dramatic purposes, because that's historical fact. We don't learn about those things enough in the educational system, but yet we have to go back to that history in order to demonstrate that this is a valid treaty right, and that Congress has as much of a role to play back then as they do today, at least the House of Representatives, in seating the delegate, because they have a responsibility to fulfill a treaty right that's nearly 200 years old. So we have had to educate about that. And so I don't think as a young person, I had enough of that tutelage going on in school or elsewhere. I had tutorials, I had tutors, I had history classes, civics classes. We're taught very little about Indian history, but we know the chapters are dark, right? We know broadly about the mistreatment of Indians in this country, but we don't know specifically what all that entailed. And so and this is part of the story of talking about the delegate, whenever we're asked, why did it take you nearly 200 years to assert this treaty right? I have to say, because the bad stuff didn't end with removal. You see, prior to removal, Cherokee Nation was a sophisticated government. We had wealth we developed wealth. We had a written language. We had school systems. All of that was taken away with forced removal, where we were subject to abject poverty. And then Congress kept enacting law after law, breaking away the communal land holdings that we held as a tribal nation and doling them out as individual land allotments to our citizens, and then enacting laws to cripple our ability to pass laws and to be governed by those laws, even taking away the authority of us to elect our own principal chief, where the President of the United States would appoint the chief of the Cherokee Nation, whose sole mission was to help take away our land, signing land deeds, so paving way for Oklahoma to become a state. That is crippling for a nation. And again, it wasn't until the 1970s that Congress once again stepped in and restored the ability of Cherokee Nations to once again elect its principal chief, to once again in the mid-70s start developing the resources so that we can start providing for the needs of our citizens and our communities to prosper and grow to a place where we are in 2022 able to assert a treaty right and to do it so effectively. So it's a long time coming, and it's something that we're not taught enough in school. And if you're going to assert something that's historic, like a treaty right in the United States, you always have to go back to when that treaty was signed and come forward, because we cannot rely on people who we're talking to who are decision makers today to know that history, and history matters.
You were talking about the organization that existed, the government that existed in the Cherokee Nation, and I have seen some of your presentations. You make often reference to Chief Mankiller.
Yeah, Wilma Mankiller. Wilma was principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And I served as her intern when I was in college. Oftentimes in this country, when we say somebody was an intern, we think of a teenager. I was actually in college when I was her intern, and she was very famous then. She had friends who were great advocates, known advocates, who were civil rights leaders, social rights leaders, feminist leaders in this country, and she would bring them to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and I got to meet these people. She was a great mentor of mine and who believed firmly in mentoring other young women. She is the one who encouraged me to go to law school, because she knew in her time of leadership that the laws were starting to become more complicated, that the more successful tribes became, the more states would start wanting to interfere in what we do on our reservation. And she's right, because we're facing that still today, and that knowing the law, being able to read a court case would only benefit me. She was very adamant about the fact that in her leadership, you are surrounded by advisors, but advisors should not rule the day, that she had to own the decisions that she was making. And oftentimes she would go against some of the advice of her lawyers, policy advisors, whoever, because she absolutely believed the way I believe, that if you're in a decision-making position, that you should own your decisions, and advisors are just there to advise. And I got to see her engage at the highest level and down to people in the community who don't have a formal education. She treated everyone with dignity and respect and was a great mentor of mine. Just this year, the United States honored her by putting her image on a quarter. So you might see her old quarter in circulation in the United States, and it's a reflection of who she was as a leader in this country.
What do you wish you had known at the start of your process as an advocate for rights of the Cherokee Nation that you know now and would have made your journey more effective?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess I wish I would have known more about our history. Working in Cherokee Nation as an intern, you kind of deal with issues in the moment. We weren't necessarily going backwards. I had to learn the law and the history, the legal history, much later in my journey to be an advocate. And I'm glad that I did get to know it. I wish I appreciated it when I was younger in age. I wish I'd appreciate it when my grandparents were still living, because my parents grew up on their land allotments. They're both Cherokee first language speakers. My parents both went to Indian boarding schools. This was a policy in the United States to assimilate the Indian. That we have a saying here that was not of our own making, but it is a policy that was referred to as "kill the Indian, save the man." It was that statement was made to mean let's assimilate Indians into mainstream society so that they forget their culture and who they are as a body, as a people. Which was proven to be ineffective. I wish I could have talked to my grandparents more about, their family's journey and about their own experiences. I didn't learn a lot of the history, legal history, until they'd already gone, they'd already passed. And a lot of people don't like talking about this. all this stuff. And, and I'm blessed that, my dad grew up in a church that was founded after removal in 1839. And that my grandparents, but not only my grandparents, my great grandparents, and before them are also, in a cemetery at that church. I mean, we've got a lot of history there that even my own immediate family didn't realize, but it's through my journey, through my own research, that I was able to discover a lot of those things. And I guess I wish I knew back then what I know now, because I sure would have loved to have had conversations with them about, what their families, what their parents taught them about us as a people and about their experiences, because my grandparents mostly just spoke Cherokee. When my grandpa passed away, he spoke more English than I spoke Cherokee because the grandkids were all speaking English around him. And he used to say that I was smarter than him. And I said, no, you're smarter than me because you've mastered 2 languages. And I'm still struggling with Cherokee. You now speak more English than I speak Cherokee. But I guess for me, it's more sentimental and more personal. I wish I knew what I knew, now back then.
In this last minute we have of this program, I would like to ask you, what is the one thing we should have in mind when we hear about the Indian nations across the U.S. that will help us understand where are the Indian nations coming from?
The Indian nations in the United States are sovereign Indian nations. In the United States, we have a federal status that's attached to it. They are called federally recognized tribes. There's over 570 federally recognized tribes in this country that have a special and legal relationship with the United States, and that we are sovereign nations. We are nations that have our own histories. We are nations that have our own histories with the United States, that have our own body of law that Congress has enacted, and at times enacted unique to a particular tribe. So I think just recognizing that we are sovereign governments and we fight every day to make sure that we retain all of the authorities that accompany that status.
Kim Teehee, it's been a great honor to speak with you. You're about to make history, but I know you understand this is a history in the making that took almost 200 years, and you have the privilege to materialize the hopes and the fight of many hundreds of thousands of Indians across the United States. Thank you for being here at the DNA of the News.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you.